Hi, Simon. Welcome. First of all, Simon, I've known Simon for, how many years is it?
Oh, getting on for 15, 20 years, something like that. 2003, I think we met.
Yeah, Phoebe started, wasn't it? Yeah, I trained to be a vicar with Simon, although I'm not vicaring at the moment. Simon, Simon,
Clearly, yes.
yeah, Simon still is, yeah. Simon, do you want to just tell us a bit about where you are? Clearly, you're not in your front room.
Yep, I'm currently sitting in my church. Okay, we're in lockdown, but I've just let a contractor in who's doing a bit of work at the other end of the church at the moment. So I happen to be in the building so you can actually see what I'm doing. I'm here in the centre of Derby in an inner city suburb called Normanton, in a church that was closed down in about 2010-11, and we reopened in 2016 after an extensive programme of redevelopment. And I'm a vicar here, have been for about 10 years. I'm also the acting area dean at Derby City at the moment.
Brilliant. And if I remember rightly, that's a church you got licensed in, and it was like, "Welcome, Simon. This is your new vicar, Simon. And by the way, this is the last service we're having in this church because it's closing down tomorrow."
That's basically the way it was. They brought me in with a very clear remit to try and reimagine this church, to try and engage it with the local community. It was definitely in a place of decline, and the advert was that it was going to be a much more community-based ministry. Much more, I suppose, in the days we now call it pioneering, but it wasn't at the time, reimagining what church would look like. But interestingly, I'd done a similar thing in my curacy church. I'd taken on a parish, well, it was a multi-parish benefice where the vicar training incumbent was down the road, and I was in the vicarage of a church that closed down. And in that case, I'd also restored an Church of England church and made that into a community hub. So when this advert came up for this post here, I applied for it and they gave me the post.
So you have a sort of history of reimagining and exploring things in a different way. Actually, your background is in that as well, isn't it? Pre-vicaring, you were doing that sort of stuff as well.
That's right. I used to be a regeneration officer and a regeneration manager. I've felt called to the inner city in 1987, 88, around the time when the Faith in the City report was kicking off and all that fuss happened. I felt God really giving me a kick up the backside to say, get out there into the inner city and start doing stuff. So I've worked in inner city neighbourhoods, working in regeneration and transformation of declining, smelly industrial estates for most of my life, really.
And and very multicultural as well. I mean, having worked in places that have had quite a sort of white working class area, it was really interesting to wander around Simon's parish that's just got a completely different feel with people from all over the world and food from everywhere. And it was, I thought it was brilliant. I was a little bit jealous, if I'm honest. But, yeah.
It's certainly, the world is, Christ called us to go to the nations. In my particular case, the nations came to us. And literally you walk down the road and you pass nearly every continent in the country. You've got Arabs, we've got Pakistanis, we've got Indians, we've got Caribbean, we've got East Europeans, we've got people from Somalia, we've got people from, all over the globe. And it's an amazing melting pot of cultures and food, and very nice food is too.
I sort of think there's something about multicultural work where you think this is just a foretaste of heaven. Do you know that idea?
Absolutely.
Yeah. One day we'll all be together, and it'll all be amazing. Yeah. And one of the things I was just couple of questions I was just going to ask you. First one really is about that idea about being at your church where they more or less shut it the next Sunday. In one sense, we've done a theme about can these bones live? From Ezekiel 37, and we've had a bit of talking about the idea of actually looking at somewhere that looks hopeless and actually saying with God things aren't hopeless, and actually looking for him to bring that resurrection, transformation, life. Is there anything in that sort of story or your story that you'd like to resonate?
Yeah, I think that's probably been the story of a lot of my sense of where we are and where God calls to us in church. Richard Rohr talks about seasons of life, seasons of the church, going through different seasons of life. That we have springtime when things are growing, we have summer when things are flourishing, then autumn when things seem to be dying off, and then there are winter times when we have to do pruning and we have to cut things back. And it's only that God calls me to places where pruning is taking place, and where when I first arrive, it appears that almost death is taking place. And yeah, I think for me, it's quite important really to hear the sense of where God is in all that. Certainly when I arrived in Birmingham, in Ward End in my curacy, when I walked around that estate, when I first thought about taking on the curacy, I felt in my heart, I felt the pain. I felt the pain of grief. I felt the pain of death. I felt that partly, I think, from the community, but also I believe from God. And certainly looking at when I was around Birmingham, the graffiti, this church itself had been spray painted all over the church. You know, it was horrendous when I first arrived. That sense of the pain and the anger that was being felt in that area. And when I came to Derby, my interview for this post here, I saw the two church wardens, as well as the vicar and not the vicar, the area dean and the archdeacon. But the two wardens, just the pained expressions on their faces, and just communicating directly to them and saying, I understand that, and I feel your pain in the fact that you're calling me here to a place where your church that you love is dying. And that sense of, can we have hope? And one of the wardens did have hope. He said, no, we believe we can have some resurrection. Yeah. And so working with him and fostering, one of the phrases my suffragan bishop, before she retired, said to us was, we are called to fan into flame the flickering candle and not to tend the ashes. Yeah. And we spend far too long, I think, tending ashes, when eventually there's a flicker of candle that we just want to try and flicker that back into life. And I think you're right, there is something about Ezekiel 37 about that. And I think there's something about Ezekiel 37.
In fact, I preach on it so often, my intern threatened to kill me if he ever heard me preach on it again. I hope he's not watching this video. Otherwise, I'm gonna be murdered by a guy who looks a bit like Thor. Yeah, that's really interesting, because actually, I love that idea about tending fire, tending candles, flame.
Foster the flame, not tend the ashes.
Because tending the ashes can feel very. You're almost capitulating. You're going alongside you're working with the death, rather than actually fostering where God is bringing the life. But actually, people want you to attend the ashes because that makes them feel like you're doing the things they want.
That's right, and it's about honouring what has passed, and I think it's important to honour, and to learn from past, and we can talk about that in a bit if you want. So I think it's important to work out the DNA and the journey that we've been on as a church, but also to recognise that some of that has to pass, and new things have to come through. But God tends to work in a cyclical manner. He tends to work in a way that this is appropriate for the area, that you can draw on some things of resources of the past that enable you to move forward to the future. You don't have to just wipe the whole lot clean. But there is then a sense that we do need to say, no, actually we need to move on to the next stage, means that some of the dead wood that we've collected along the way needs to be broken off. When we had our first service in here back in 2016-17, it was an Easter vigil, and I think there's something deeply moving about Easter vigils, deeply moving about Easter Saturday in this story. That we're in the waiting time of between death and resurrection, and we came into this building having lit the Easter fire outside, and we walked in and we read Ezekiel 37, can these dry bones live? And with that anxiety and hope, a group of us worked into the church, and we went to the side chapel where the original congregation had met as a small group of them, about 7 or 8 of them, for many faithful years. And we'd put a lot of dead wood on the altar, the very altar which they'd had communion on. And we read the story of Isaac and Abraham and Isaac, and about, will you sacrifice Isaac here? And that sense of having to give up that space. And then we moved into the central aisle, and we read the passage from Ezekiel and Jeremiah around taking your heart of stone and giving you a heart of flesh, and saying, will you break that heart of stone and embrace the heart of love? And we held a chocolate heart in our hands as it melted, as we felt the melting heart. And then we walked up to literally this table behind me, and we read the story from Ezekiel 40 about the water of life coming out of the table, and you can see the table behind me, flowing out into the community. And we took these blue ribbons that we tied behind me and rolled them all out into the street, down the aisle and out to the street, and said, actually, we need to move out of this building and out to make life happen. And so for me, there's something prophetic about making prophetic statements, and that was quite prophetic in what we were trying to do.
And I think there's something exciting about it. Also ties in with the Eucharistic prayer, D. There, she proves I'm still an Anglican, really. That idea of God's story and our story become one story as we partner with Him. And the idea of pruning, I think, is really exciting as well, because actually you don't kill the tree; you take off the bits that aren't fruitful. But if you read the bit in John where Jesus talks about pruning, he says, you know, that the Father cuts off the bits that don't bear fruit. And then he says, and the bits that do bear fruit, he prunes. So you don't, actually, none of us escape pruning. But it's actually about working with God to bring life. And I love that. I love that phrase. The other thing you said about is about the prophetic and about sort of drawing on old story. One of the things you've got is you've recently birthed a new community now within one of the churches of a new monastic community, building very much on the sort of historic Celtic, Aidan, some of the old saints and stuff. So a sort of an old flavour of Christianity for a modern era and a changing time. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about the St. Thomas story and?
Yeah, St. Thomas's is where we are. St. Thomas's was formed back in the 1880s by a guy called Alfred Olivier, who himself was a church planter. I discovered he came and planted this church and grew this church in 3 years, built the church up with a philanthropic gift of lots of money that he got given to enable him to do it. But he was very much a mission-minded man, and he wanted a place where the poor of the neighbourhood, and it was a really railway workers' neighbourhood at the time, could gather together, and the awe of the gold behind me and the sense of occasion would bring a sense of God's presence into the midst. And so he brought this old-looking church into the centre of a working-class neighbourhood and brought a sense of God's mission into it. That was the story we discovered as we unpacked it. And as we looked at it, we felt there's very much this call to be the presence of God in the midst of quite a challenging area, to be a beacon, a light to that area, to be a service to that area. And as we've just discussed that, as you say, Aidan came to mind. There's a picture of Aidan literally behind me on the window here. He's very much part of the story of this church. Aidan had a place of a prayer on his island, on Lindisfarne. But then when the tide went out, he went out and amongst those in need and met those in need. But then he came back into his place of prayer. And that rhythm of prayer and action really spoke to a small group of us that had gathered once I've been licensed in this place which closed down, as you rightly said. A group of us has gathered to pray and to pray and to pray. And we believe that God was calling us this to be a place of prayer that then would launch us into acting in the neighbourhood in terms of acts of service, but then back into a place of prayer. And this rhythm of prayer and mission was very much part of what we felt God was calling us to here. And that's what then emerged into a monastic community. And this community has now been going probably about 2 to 3 years. We joined the Society of the Holy Trinity, which is a network of Anglican new monastic communities. And we're one of the founder members of that community, supported by Ian Mobsby and his team in London. And I'm part of the chapter of that organisation now, as we look together to explore what an urban expression of new monasticism looks like. And we're very passionate about service to the poor and the needy in urban settings in the Society of the Holy Trinity.
Brilliant. And one of the other questions I was going to ask you, which is on a slightly different topic, and we thought probably been a bit, I'd never make a Parkinson, but we're going back to your original story, the idea about building on the old and discovering the story and grieving and working with God in all that he's doing, that sort of partnership with God. We recently interviewed a guy called John Good, who was talking about a very similar thing to you, really, where he was more or less given a blank canvas from the Baptist Church to go and do something in something that was no longer the church he was, that he would have been the vicar of, if you get one, or the minister of, was shut down, and they basically released the money to enable him to do something new. He talked a bit about his feelings with the with having a blank canvas. How be interested to see how you felt when you were sort of you're given a new role that's not been done before. The church that you would have been vicar of isn't open, and suddenly you've got to discover what is God doing when actually my canvas is blank. I haven't got all the expectations and diary things that that would sometimes come if I was in a much more traditional or not so pioneering role.
Absolutely right, and I think this your key. I think there's two things which really have been really important for me in the journey. One is about gathering a team. I don't think Jesus ever sent us out one by one. He sent us out two by two. And I think the importance of gathering a team, when we started the prayer to reflect on what to do here, about 4 of us gathered around a very cold church gas heater. It was the only bit of warmth we had in the corner. Amongst the smell and the damp was impossible, and the water pouring down the walls, when we could see the green mold growing, and just saying, what are we doing here, God? Why are you calling us here? What are we doing here? And just spending a lot of time praying and discerning, and lots of bits of flip charts stuck on pillars in the church, just to say, where are you calling us to? And so both working together as a team, but also praying into it was really quite important bedrock. The second thing is about making connections beyond the church, and going out into the street and making those connections beyond the church. I spent a lot of time walking these streets, a lot of time praying these streets. We prayer walked on a regular basis, and seeing what's happening in the neighbourhood, what the type of people are in this neighbourhood, what the type of businesses and shops are. Starting to make connections at the school. I've been governor at the school now for 7, 8, 9 years, getting very much involved in the life of the local school, get involved in the local organisations. We're just doing some partnership with the local health clinic here, local charities. I've been working with 2 or 3 local charities. One charity is doing work with reaching out to street girls, sex workers on the street who gather down the street. So we're working together with them and the health centre to now do a health drop-in for that in the evening, for night workers in the evening, to come and have a confidential support working from health doctors and health checks, for sexual health checks. So that's working with both the doctors that we begin to make connections with on the street, next door to us as a clinic, but making connections to a local charity, and then where the people are in the evening to support them. So this church in the evening is going to become effectively a clinic in the evening, but we want to make that into a night church and into a place where people can connect. So that sense of where are people at and where people needs are at the moment, identifying what they are, it's very much a prayerful walking and prayerful connecting. And I spent a lot of time now in a lot of meetings on Zoom with a lot of people. You'd have thought, why am I stuck in board meetings and discussion meetings? But actually they're about being the salt where they're at and shaping those where they are. So yes, it's not about servicing the existing. It's not about, keeping the existing going. It's not about services. It's not about funerals and weddings and baptisms. It's not about, who's latest on the rota to do this or that. It's very, very, very much about trying to find out what God's doing in the community at large and trying to connect with that, and then turn the church inside out. How can this church serve the needs of the neighbourhood and be a resource for the neighbourhood, which is very much what Alfred Olivier did when he built the church in the first place, and we felt we very much flowed that DNA.
Brilliant. And can I get probably need to come into land. I had a whole lot of questions I was going to ask you, most of which I haven't asked you actually, but I think you've been fascinatingly interesting. Probably you'll have to do another interview with you. You just shouldn't be so wise, Simon. That's the problem. But one of the things I find fascinating about Simon, and I'm slightly going to embarrass him now, but is he's very good. He's very good at working with guys who life's been tough and difficult for, and sort of people who are having a tough time, but he's also very good at being able to work with government agencies and charities and that sort of stuff. And there's something really interesting about almost a bilingualness that you have about being able to be both salt and light in 2 very different contexts completely authentically, which I think is something we don't think about often enough. Is how can I be an amazing ambassador for Jesus when I'm talking to the chief executive of the council, when I'm talking to the police and whatever commissioner, when I'm talking to the head teacher or whatever, and then later on in the day, how can I be salt and light for Jesus when I'm chatting to someone who's who for whatever reason the bottom's dropped out of their world, their life's messy and chaotic, and actually holding those 2 together with authenticity is something really hard that Simon actually does incredibly well. And I think that was something you did your MPhil on, wasn't that right?
Yeah. So there's 2 things, several things I could mention on that. back to Aidan again. Aidan being my inspiration, my spiritual hero. He spent his time on the island praying, his time amongst the poor, but he also spent a lot of time in Bamburgh Castle, talking to King Oswald and challenging him about some of his perceptions about giving your horses away and things like that, rather than. So there's a thing about inspirational about Aidan's life that's always inspired me in that way. For me, I think there's the two passages that inspire me massively outside of that Ezekiel, which you mentioned a moment ago about dry bones lived. One is Isaiah 61. I know a lot of people feel passionate about Isaiah 61, but one thing which struck me about Isaiah 61 from somebody once was look at the pronouns. Yeah. If you read the pronouns in Isaiah 61, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he's anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to release the oppressed. So it's all about what the God has done to me. But then as you read on, it says, in order that they may restore the ancient ruins, that they may restore the place long devastated, for they will be called the oaks of righteousness. And it's moved to they. And what it says is about we preach good news, we pray care and attention for those who mourn and those who are oppressed, in order that they restore the ancient ruins, in order that they restore the places long devastated. And it's about empowerment, and it's about empowering. And what we're called to do is to empower and to equip people to do that. So that really drives me as part of my work amongst those who need, is that I want to actually give them the tools to do the job. But in order to do that, you've got to unlock a few things above to actually get the people to say they've got to have confidence that these are the right people to work with. And you've got to give people confidence that they can actually engage. And I think there's something really important around the second part of reading that really gets to me is Jeremiah chapter 29, which is seek the welfare of the city where I place you into exile. And it's about seeking well-being whilst you're in exile, in order that the city, the power, the Babylon, the people who've got the control might prosper. So what actually is you're working for the prosperity, not of the poor or Jerusalem, but the prosperity of Babylon, this great power block. But in their well-being is your well-being. In it. And that is the plan that I have for you. The plan to prosper you is through working with them. And there's something quite empowering of those who need through working with those who you wouldn't expect to work with.
Yeah. It's one of those verses that's so taken out of context sometimes, isn't it? The Jeremiah 29.
Oh, absolutely.
I've done it.
And the context there is about plans in the midst of working in a place where we have no power, where we have no influence, where we have no control, where we are working with somebody else who has got the power and the influence and the control, and the command is to work with them, and then you find your peace and prosperity, which is not quite how do we expect that verse to work.
Brilliant. And I'm going to just wrap up now because we've had some great stuff. So a lot of the questions I was going to ask you, probably not going to ask you. Just one thing to finish. If you're going to meet a youthful Simon Cartwright about to embark on inner city mission, what would you say to yourself, knowing what you know now? What would you say to a younger version of yourself about to start out?
Pace yourself.
Yeah.
It takes time.
Yeah.
It's a long haul. I've been doing this 10 years and we're still by no means finished by a long way. We're still a long way from where it's going to. So inner city ministry in particular takes a long time. I used to go to the New Wine UPA forum, and they used to say to us the importance of long haul ministry for inner cities is really quite important. And hold lightly to what you're doing right now, because it's likely to change. I think if you do things and the project emerges and it's great and it's going really well, the likelihood is that project will change and morph and adapt and change. So hold lightly to things, because things are mobile and adapt and change, and be willing to not hold too fixed to things. And thirdly, I guess what I said earlier on, gather a team and pray. Don't try and do it on your own. You need a team and you need to pray. And for me, prayer is the underbelly. It's what holds us all together. I think there's a quote from my colleague who runs the Diocese Fresh Expressions here in Derby. She's a wonderful lady called Beth Honey. And she says, the place where waiting and openness meet is prayer. The place where openness and waiting meet is prayer. And I think that's such a powerful message for us in this lockdown times. So much so I printed that off and it sits right next to my laptop at home. Because I think that's so much what we're called to at this moment, is the place where openness, waiting is prayer.
Thank you so much, Simon. That's been brilliant, and it's been brilliant to see a bit of your church in the background as well. So thank you, and yeah, and I was going to say we'll have to interview you again because I think there's still lots more there. Like I say, you shouldn't be so worried.
Okay, take care, my friend. Okay,
Bless
God bless.
you.